Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Arisate, and I'm the Development Roundtable Coordinator for this year's Development Roundtable series. The SITE's Development Roundtable is a high-profile speaker series where leaders and practitioners within the international development community speak to our students, faculty, and broader community about trends and challenges that are shaping the field. On behalf of the International Development Department, I would like to thank you today to today's event with Brian Levy. Brian Levy is a professor of practice of international development at the School of International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the academic director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. He worked at the World Bank from 1989 to 2012, including as a manager for the Africa Vice Presidency Public Sector Reform and Capacity Building Unit, and as the head of the secretariat responsible for the design and implementation of the World Bank's Group's Governance and Anti-Corruption Program. He has also published widely on the interactions among institutions, political economy, and development policy. Today's event will be the first launch of Professor Levy's new book, The Politics and Governance of Basic Education, A Tale of Two South African Provinces. This book was also co-written with his colleagues at Cape Town. During today's discussion, Professor Levy will give us an insight into what happens when inclusive agendas and bureaucratic rigidities collide. For example, why, despite far-reaching democratic transitions, has it been so difficult for South Africa to achieve the ambitious goals it set out for education since the dawn of its democracy? What broader lessons can be drawn from South Africa's experience as to how political contexts shape the performance of public education bureaucracies? Professor Levy will address this and more during today's Development Roundtable. For more on the topic, please join me in welcoming Professor Levy.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. As Stephanie said, this event is both sharing of ideas. It also serves as the launch of a book. And one of the attractive features of this particular book is, by arrangement with Oxford University Press, it's available for free download. So there is a handout that is available, and on that handout you will find the web address through which you can access the book. So this talk is actually at the intersection of multiple themes in the development discourse. First, one of the key themes is the challenge of inclusive development, a challenge which is central everywhere. Indeed, the challenge of inclusion is central not only in developing countries, but as we now increasingly learn in high-income countries too, with education as at the heart of that challenge. Second, the talk addresses another global issue, which one might call the learning crisis. If we go back 3 decades, 2-3 decades, the education challenge was seen to be a challenge of access to schools. As we'll see, the access challenge has in large part been addressed, but now there's a huge challenge globally of turning access into learning outcomes. I'll speak to that. Third, the third theme which is highlighted is an evolving theme in development practice, and that's the move from a one-size-fits-all vision of best practice as a way forward with development towards being able to be more systematic about what one might call good fit. And as you will see in this talk, I try to suggest ways in which one could address that. And finally, I take on these 3 topics in the context of a case study, and it's the case study of South Africa, a country which, if we were to go back a little more than 2 decades, was a country that was globally hailed as achieving a democratic miracle, but which, as of 2018, is a country which seems to disappoint. And the question is why. So perhaps a little bit immodestly and overambitiously, I'm going to try to address all 4 of those topics with one case study. And I will do this in 4 parts. First, we'll just talk about the challenge of inclusion, specifically in the context of South Africa, South Africa's challenge of inclusion. Then give you a little taste of the issues surrounding the crisis of learning outcomes. Then talk about what I've called bureaucratic rigidities. Rigidities, as you'll see, is broadly defined, how things go wrong, and then finally address the issue of what is to be done. Now, when it comes to the challenge of inclusion, South Africa is in many ways, one can think of this as something of the canary in the coal mine. because South Africa, coming out of its apartheid history, emerges as perhaps the world's most unequal country. And just to give you a sense of those data, and this is just a small snapshot of a much richer, more detailed theme, if we take as a measure the share of total expenditure by the top 10% of the population, it's a measure for which there's globally comparable data. In South Africa in 2010, that number was 53%. 53% of all spending was by the top 10% of the population. Just to flag, those of you familiar with these data, expenditure is one of the least unequal seeming of the measures, and inequality in wealth is way, way more unequal. I will come back to that. The poster child for inequality among middle-income countries had been, and in some minds still is, Brazil. Brazil, since the year 2000, has been through quite a lot of shift in its income distribution. But just to locate South Africa for you, in 2000, before the Lula reforms in Brazil, Brazil's expenditure share of the top 10% was 47% of the total, significantly lower than South Africa in 2010. Mexico's share was another unequal country, was 40%, and the US, where we know we confront a huge issue, the 1%, the 10%, and this is expenditure. The US, just to put the South African number in perspective, after taxes and transfers, the expenditure share of the top 10% is 31%. So we're dealing with a country in South Africa with extraordinary inequality. That extraordinary inequality which continues to be very heavily correlated with the ethnic composition of the society. Whites account for only 9% of the South African population, but 60% of the top 10% are white. So 2 in every 3 white South Africans is in the top 10% of the earnings distribution in the country. So that number's true as of 2010, probably largely true today as well. So if we ask the question then, so what happened? What was the impact of South Africa's 1994 democratic miracle? Well, one of the crucial consequences of that democratic miracle was a program of universal social grants. Very small, $100 a month, but it turns out that this economy is so unequal in its nature that for the bottom 50% of the population, those social grants, $100 per month, which go not to everybody, they go to pensioners, they go to children. Those social grants account for more than half of the income of the bottom 50% of the population. So extreme poverty with hunger has fallen sharply because of that. Public spending on services, on which I'll have more to say when we look at education, has also shifted radically. There was also another consequence of the end of apartheid. The end of apartheid meant that South Africa was no longer isolated from the rest of the world. So there was a repricing of assets. The stock market property assets, which produced even higher patterns of wealth inequality than existed during the period of apartheid. So that's that broad data on inequality. Let's look at how this links to education, the subject of this talk. First point to make is that returns to education are critical in addressing inequality. Half of overall income inequality in the country can be explained by differences in wage rates. It's the differences in earnings account for half of that total inequality in the country. There's something particularly unusual given the history about how wage rates and education link, but in South Africa, the returns to the completion, not the taking, the completion of 12 years of education and the 13th year and the 14th year of education are extraordinarily high. As we see, a black South African male with 14 years of education earns twice what a black South African male with just 12 years of education earns. So that's second feature of the link between apartheid inequality and education is the nature of the inequality of spending on education during apartheid. So as was mentioned, I teach also at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, where I teach mid-career public officials who typically in their late 30s and early 40s. So their parents would often be the same age as me, and half of them would be black South Africans. And it's not easy to stand before a group of black South Africans, you can tell from my accent I'm originally from South Africa, and say that for every dollar that was spent on my public education, 6 cents was spent on the education of your parents. You know, this was a country in which at the peak of apartheid, the prime minister said, Black South Africans don't need to learn mathematics. Their future is hewers of wood and drawers of water. So that's the education history. You can see it in the high school completion rates. 1970s, high school completion rate among white South Africans was 80%, less than 1% among black South Africans. Rises in the early 1990s to 25%, but the inequalities in education, quality education, persist. If you look at the last row on that table, the fraction whose high school completion is at a sufficient level that you can enter university is about 32% for whites, remains at 3% for black South Africans. So clearly, when you look at data like these, it becomes evident that unless inclusion is differently addressed, and unless education quality is addressed, then this is a society where it's very hard to conceive of a sustainable and thriving future. So what then did democracy achieve in terms of improving education outcomes? So the first is probably one of the most eminent scholars of education globally, a fellow called Louis Crouch, who now works with RTI, was at the World Bank, spent quite some years actually, interestingly, working in South Africa. He was quoted as saying, he has a chapter in the book, that the reduction in the inequality in public spending for education in South Africa in the immediate wake of democracy is unequaled in modern history in terms of the rate of the change in the distribution of spending on education. Just to have one piece of data there, the spending going to the top 20% of the population distribution of schools falls from 28% in the early 1990s to 14% in 2000. And just to note that 28% signals a significant change within South Africa between the late 60s and the early 90s already in the pattern of distribution. That significant change also meant that if you look at the South African data in the early 1990s in terms of access, by the early 1990s, South Africa had universal access to primary education. Its participation rates in secondary education, which I showed you, weren't that far off the norm, but as you see, secondary enrollment does rise between 1993 and 2010. Also, as part of this shift, there was an extraordinary institutional transformation of the education system in South Africa. It went from this racialized system with 19 different education departments in the country to a system which actually successfully implemented what Latin American countries in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s were struggling to halfway implement. Successfully implemented a delegation at the national level, the provincial level, and the school level in terms of the roles and responsibilities at each level, with significant authority down at the school level for school governing bodies in which a majority of the participants in that body are parents. So this is what was achieved. If you look at it from this dimension, we see extraordinary rapid change early, what looks like a huge opportunity. We see these numbers are impressive, but then we get to the challenge of learning outcomes. And these will come back repeatedly through the talk. So at this stage, I'm just going to provide an initial teaser on the data on learning outcomes. And I do want to put this into context. One of the features of a South African discourse is everything there is perceived to be catastrophic and the worst in the world. So it's useful to step back and look at how these numbers look more broadly. So here's some data which is not South Africa, but it's just to give you a taste of this dilemma of access versus quality in learning. The Millennium Development Goals, 2000, one of them was universal access to primary education. It has, in fact, overwhelmingly been achieved. Not entirely, but to an extraordinary degree. We see the achievement of universal access to primary education around the world. What we don't see is we don't see gains in learning. I will come back to it later, but for those of you who are interested in the space, the 2018 World Development Report, Learning to Realize Education's Promise, is a particularly good document on the space. And when you can read example after example of the disconnect between schooling and learning, as Lon Pritchard put it. Here I just give you some examples from some of the portion of kids that can finish second grade but still can't read a word. The disconnect between kids who pass through many years of school, but there's actually almost no improvement in the learning outcomes. And you can find when you really immerse yourself in this data, it almost becomes, I dare say, a version of development pornography, where let me give you another example of disaster. No, I've got a worse example of disaster. And it can go on and on in this space. And in that, well, not in that spirit, because it's what has been the focus of this multi-year research project. Let me locate for you a South Africa in this. And this data, what it is these are 2 global standardized tests. This one is a standardized test on maths and science conducted for 8th and 9th grades, and this is a standardized test on reading. And this is a scatter plot where what you do is you have the predicted value versus the actual value when you control for a whole series of other socioeconomic and other variables. If a country was performing as expected, it would be on the 45-degree line. This is the distribution of countries that take this test. This test is mostly done by middle and low-income countries, so we want to put it in that context. But as you can see, whether we're looking at the math score or whether we're looking at the reading score, South Africa emerges in the 2015 standardized tests as an extreme negative outlier. Its actual score is way below its predicted score once you control for a whole variety of other variables. Now, again, I want us to put this number into some perspective, because there's another number which is barely spoken about, but which I think we want to keep in mind. This doesn't mean, this next number I'm going to show you doesn't mean things are okay, but it provides this perspective. This is the data on the score on the maths and science test in 2003, 2011, and 2015. The increase, now what we saw a moment ago were the 2015 numbers, where we saw South Africa to be an extreme negative performer. If we look at the increase between 2003 and 2015, it's among the fastest increases ever seen. How do we square these? We square these by noting that in 2003, the outcomes were catastrophic. By 2015, they were only disastrous. Okay? So, that's how change happens. It's a dilemma. Certainly, there's absolutely no reason when we look at the data, and did some of what I will share with you. We can't be complacent about what we see, but we need to also have this perspective on the data. And that brings me to why. That brings me to the theme of the talk, how things can go wrong, what I called bureaucratic rigidities. And I'll come back to what I mean by bureaucratic rigidities in a moment. But I also want to bring another broader perspective before I go into these governance and bureaucratic dimensions of what we observe. And this is a perspective which is best communicated by sharing with you this framework, which is from the 2018 World Development Report that I spoke about earlier, which, as I said, I think is a superb report. One of the dilemmas when you read the literature on education, and this is true in general, but it turns out to be especially true, it seems to me, in this education space. People often say about development practitioners, if you have a hammer, you see nails everywhere. And this discourse in education is just like that. If you're involved in teacher training, you know that teacher training is the necessary and sufficient condition for improving education outcomes. If you're involved in curriculum, you know it's that. Whatever your choice, whatever you happen to be doing, you know is the solution. What this World Development Report does so nicely is it signals the relationship between proximate and underlying causes of the outcome. So the target is learning. The proximate causes that the literature identifies as being central are learners prepared, skills of teachers, quality of school management, the inputs that come to schools. But what this report does so beautifully is it points out, and I'll come back to this again at the end of this talk, it points out that each of these are embedded in a much more complex system of stakeholders. And that if we want to understand why the proximate inputs are provided in the way that they are or they aren't, what we can do is we can step back and understand the governance arrangements that bridge from all of these stakeholders into what happens in the education system as a whole. And that's the theme that I will be probing. I'll be looking, if you like, at the governance arrangements. I'll be looking at them from a particular angle, from the particular perspective of what I call bureaucratic rigidities, how things can go wrong. And I will do this by focusing on, well, I'll focus on two different ways in which things go wrong, but I also want to note the third. The third is the one that I've bracketed there. It's what I call the South African national level. For those of you that are interested in the experience with public management and new public management, and there are multiple such people in the room, but I am looking at Dan Honig in particular, I would urge you to look, that's Dan, my colleague, I would urge you to look at chapter 3 of the book. Chapter 3 of the book describes how South Africa in the mid-1990s chose to embrace global best practice in public management. I remember being struck by this in the latter 1990s in the World Bank at the way in which South Africa really was on the cutting edge of what it takes to do new public management. What chapter 3 of the book does is it asks the question, what's the relationship between the narrative of new public management and the practice of what actually happened? And it works through that, and what you discover when you read that chapter is you discover how there was a narrative out there which was a very politically comfortable narrative for external consumption. But when it came to what actually was happening and was being done, when it came to the decisions where some of these new public management aspects would or would not have bite, they systematically backed away. And that's known in the literature, those of you familiar with this, as isomorphic mimicry. The pretense of doing something when the actuality, in a sense, pulls the teeth of what's real. And that's one of the ways in which the interface between the bureaucracy and the politics produce outcomes that are different from the seeming outcomes. In this case, it's around policy at the national level. The other two that I'm going to focus on are two matched pair comparisons. It's a comparison of as I mentioned earlier, South Africa's education system delegates implementation to the provincial level, to the state level. And this work compares two of those provinces. The Western Cape, which as we will see in a moment, is in the South African context a strong performer. And I'm going to draw a comparison now with the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. And as you will see, I call that one, the quote, rigidity is actually the role of patronage and fragmented patronage, which you will see. But then I will also draw a comparison between the Western Cape and Kenya, okay, which turns out to be particularly interesting and revealing. So let's begin with the first of those. Let's begin with this comparison of the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. And I want to begin here. This is an interesting source of data on the quality of bureaucracies. It was a study done by South Africa, South African National Presidency, had something called the Department of Policy Monitoring and Evaluation. The National Presidency was, of course, that's the ANC. It was Zuma. The Western Cape, during the period this was done, was governed by the opposition party. So we can treat these data as unlikely to be, quote, biased in favor of the Western Cape. But nonetheless, the data emerges very clearly. What they do is they have 31 key performance indicators. And around those key performance indicators, they rate how does each province do, its education department, in relation to these key performance indicators. Full compliance is level 3. Not quite full compliance is level 2. Way short of compliance is level 1. And level 4 is going beyond full compliance to pressing towards excellence. And as you can see in these data, the Western Cape is at least fully compliant with about 80% of the indicators. With close to half of the indicators, it goes way beyond full compliance. And that made it the highest performer. Gauteng is another province, was the second highest performer for comparison. The weakest performer amongst the four was the other province that I will look at. It is the Eastern Cape, where 60%, in relation to 60% of those indicators, the Eastern Cape falls way short of full compliance. So this is simply, note what this is. This is a set of public management professionals looking at a bureaucracy and asking how well is it performing. There's another way in which you can get at this, which is to look at learning outcomes and ask, how do learning outcomes differ and why? And There are, as another, I gave you the TIMS and the PEARLs earlier, but another source of measures of learning outcomes is something called the South African Consortium for Monitoring Education Quality. This measures across 9 southern and eastern African countries. Kenya, you will see, I will come to later. I think Tanzania's in there, Zambia's in there, Malawi's in there, across southern and eastern Africa, and many of these are broken down subnationally. And in South Africa, you can break these data down by the province. And what you can see here is that, ignore the fact that that's red for now, you'll see why that's the case later. The Western Cape emerges among the 9 South African provinces as the best performing of the 9 provinces, not just now measuring the quality of the bureaucracy, but measured by learning outcomes. And the question that all SAIS students would then ask is, but what about all the other variables? We need to control for a variety of other variables, and we did. There's a chapter 6 in the book, is a careful econometric study which measures what we call the Western Cape effect. And the way that we do this, the 30-second version, is you run an education production function, you put a dummy variable on the right-hand side, having added all the other variables on the right-hand side for the location. And that will tell you, once you've controlled for socioeconomic characteristics, for teacher characteristics, for parent characteristics, for a whole variety of other variables, the residual you can interpret as, in significant part, a measure of governance. And what we see, and we've got the study does this for a variety of different settings, but the Western Cape effect relative to the Eastern Cape, controlling for all of these variables, is large and positive. So we know that this better bureaucracy produces better learning outcomes. And we also can see it when we drill down into the details of how this bureaucracy functions. Just aside here, in some level, you know, if you came here in order for me to tell you that if you've got a better bureaucracy, you get better outcomes, and you've got a worse bureaucracy, then I brought you here under false. If that's what I'm going to tell you, I brought you here under false pretenses, and you may as well leave now, because that's a trivial result. So there's more to come, but I want to anchor that result first, because we see it. I don't want this talk to be interpreted as saying bureaucracy and the quality of bureaucracy doesn't matter. So what does it mean that this is a well-functioning bureaucracy? And it's interesting to compare them. First, there's significant continuity in the leadership in this bureaucracy. Both the top technocratic officials, as well as especially the top technocratic officials, a lot of stability over time. Over 20 years, there were essentially 3 senior bureaucrats running the Western Cape bureaucracy. The Eastern Cape, by contrast, has much more turnover. Second, it turns out that in classic Weberian fashion, the lines of hierarchy function as you'd expect them to work. The financial and human resources are managed tightly. And what was particularly impressive when we did this, the in-depth look at the Western Cape bureaucracy was done with a University of Cape Town colleague of mine. We did this together, called Robert Cameron, is that the Western Cape education bureaucracy has this incredibly impressive war room in which it tracks in real time the data on how learners are doing, on school improvement plans and how the schools are responding in relation to these. It's got a remarkable set of implementation tools built in on budgeting, on staffing and procurement. It looks truly impressive. As you see in the slide, as we talk about in the book, it's chapter 5 of the book, the Eastern Cape looks nothing like that. In each case, if you take the obverse, you would see it. So here's what I think of as one of the important messages that does emerge from the comparison of the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. Getting from a bureaucracy that looks like the Eastern Cape to a bureaucracy that looks like the Western Cape is not a matter of just do it. It's not a matter of saying, let's find the right consultants, the right staff with the right skills and have them do it and then everything will be fine. Because what the study underscores is how deeply rooted in context are these two radically different performances of these bureaucracies. And again, for the details of this, you need to go to the book. I can give you a little taste of it now. There are stark differences between these two provinces socioeconomically, politically, and in terms of the nature of their inherited institutions. And these translate through a variety of causal mechanisms, which are pretty well documented in the literature, into, in the Western Cape case, a set of mutually reinforcing positive contextual pressures which encourage a better performing bureaucracy. I'll explain these in a moment. And in the Eastern Cape case, a perfect storm of hazards, dysfunctions, constraints which make bureaucratic reform extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Let me illustrate that for you. I'll just highlight for you the four causal mechanisms which, which this comes through. The first one, one of the things that we, quote, know about democracies is that when your middle class grows, that provides a strong buttress for the democratic institutions and for pressure on performance. And indeed, in these two provinces, this relative size of the middle class is radically different. You can get a first approximation even if the income distribution between the two was the same. The Western Cape's per capita income is 3 times that of the Eastern Cape. So, and when you take that down, that means that basically in the Eastern Cape, 70% of the population is poor and another 15% is borderline poor. Excellent studies done that define these. In the Western Cape, 40% of the population is middle class, and I think it's more than half is middle class or above. So insofar as middle classes are a good buttress for the quality of performance in democracies, it's strong in the Western Cape, it's weak in the Eastern Cape. Second demand-side pressure is the competitive nature of elections. One of the things that the literature tells us is that the more competitive our elections, the more is likely to be the pressure for performance on the part of the ruling party, for reasons that have to do with history and ethnicity. In the Western Cape, the electoral process is highly contested. It turns out that over 20 years, there have been 7 different either governments in power or coalitions. In the Eastern Cape, by contrast, there has been a single party which, at least as of 2017, has been dominant, winning 70% to upwards to 85% of the vote. So as a demand-side pressure, the competitive elections is strong in the Western Cape. It's absent in the Eastern Cape. Now let's look at the supply side. One of the interesting propositions in the literature is that electoral pressures only work insofar as citizens believe the claims of politicians to be credible. So when politicians say that what they are going to do is deliver good quality services, will citizens believe that? Whether or not they believe it will depend on in important parts on whether they think that delivery is possible. Well, the Western Cape, for reasons we discuss in the book, has a long history of relatively strong bureaucratic institutions, which the transition from apartheid to democracy served not to disrupt, and indeed it was a reasonably smooth transition. The Eastern Cape, by contrast, was one of the focal points of what in the apartheid era was called the Bantustan policy. Two of every 3 citizens in the Eastern Cape had previously been parts of these so-called independent Bantustans, Transkei and Ciskei, both of which were organized through personalized patronage networks. So the legacy, the bureaucratic legacy that the Eastern Cape inherits is a bureaucratic legacy of personalized patronage. And then finally, as if that was not enough, what happened post-1994 in the Eastern Cape? What happened post-1994 in the Eastern Cape is all the former political almost all, the former political leaders and bureaucrats in those Bantustans joined the governing ANC for political convenience. The ANC was anyway in the Eastern Cape ideologically a pretty broad tent. So what you have in the Eastern Cape is a political party which, while seemingly dominant, is internally enormously fragmented. And that produced, if we ask what are the political and institutional and economic roots of the dysfunction of the Eastern Cape bureaucracy, that produced the following. It produced this legacy of personalized governance, weak voice from the political demand side, political fragmentation and ongoing contestation inside the bureaucracy. Just two anecdotes for you there. One of the participants in the master's program in Cape Town was an official in the Central Department of Basic Education. He would visit the provinces to meet with mid-level bureaucratic officials. That was his task across the country. And what he discovered was, in the Eastern Cape, whenever he arrived, the person he was going to meet was either about to exit or had just entered and hadn't yet discovered the limits of their power, but was gone the next time he visited. Basically, if you're sitting in the middle of the Eastern Cape bureaucracy and through the bureaucratic hierarchy, your superior says, I need you to do X. What you then do is you ask, what's my political patronage network? What's his political patronage network? Does my political patronage network trump his? In which case I can ignore what was there. So this is one of the natures of what was operating. And as a really interesting natural experiment, can good technocratic intervention trump politics? It was tried in the Eastern Cape. Things were going so badly that the Central National Department of Education stepped in and said, we're going to run the Eastern Cape education bureaucracy for some years. We're going to turn this around. That was in 2011. After 3 or 4 years, when you went back to look at what had happened, you discover that, I mean, I watched this process. You can track this through the media. You can see the enthusiasm with which they start, and you can see what happens in year 2. And then by the time you get to year 4, it was very difficult to find any story about this, because what basically happened is they gave up. They gave up and they went home, and they went home quietly. Because when it comes to understanding, and this is perhaps in the same way as I said, don't get too. I'm not just offering you the obvious conclusion that bureaucracies are helpful. I'm also not offering you the seemingly obvious pessimism that the pessimistic corollary to the point I'm making. The point that I'm making is that what is achievable in a bureaucracy is profoundly shaped by context. You might say, well, if that's the case and you've got the perfect storm of dysfunction, which is the Eastern Cape story, you may as well go home. Maybe not. Because part of the nature of thinking politically and thinking contextually about ways forward is to ask, what are the entry points in different contexts? So part of where I'm going to go next is to explore that question, using the example of the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. So then, just to clarify where we've been, and then move on to the next step in this talk, why it matters, the bleak outcomes, the problems of what I called rigidities. In this case, it was the example of fragmented patronage. And now I'm going to get to the comparison of the Western Cape, not with the Eastern Cape, but with Kenya, which surfaces a different set of themes. And just to get this going, keep in mind, as you look at these data which compare Kenya and the Western Cape, is the amount of available Kenya's per capita income is about a quarter of South Africa's. The amount of available spending per pupil in Kenya is 1/4 of what's available in South Africa. The Western Cape we saw was the best performing of the country's provinces. Here's a comparison between the Western Cape and Kenya in terms of learning outcomes. If you take the whole of Kenya, at the bottom, the 25th percentile of the distribution, already Kenya outperforms, across the entire country, outperforms the Western Cape. If you look at we've got central Kenya and Nairobi in the sample. I put Nairobi here as probably the better comparison with the Western Cape. As you see in these data, Kenya significantly outperforms the Western Cape in these learning results. Now, anyone who's worked in Kenya, and given what I've described about the Western Cape bureaucracy, will know that this is not because Kenya has got a much better performing, well-oiled bureaucratic machine than the Western Cape. That is not the explanation for these numbers. But there's something interesting here to be explained. And again, we did the econometrics. When we control for socioeconomic characteristics, when we control for the quality of teachers and teacher training, parental, a whole variety, the result is robust. Relative to Kenya, the Western Cape effect is robustly negative, which is interesting and is an interesting puzzle. Taking that further, another interesting piece of data is that if you look across the SACMEC countries and you do the same exercise on predicted versus actual outcomes, and these data are for 2007, the Kenya education story over the last decade becomes much messier. I'll talk about Kenya, but everything I'm going to say, in a sense, is up to 2007. What we can see is that Kenya emerges among the SACMEC countries as a strong positive outlier. So what's going on here? What is it first that means that, notwithstanding this incredibly high-performing bureaucratic machine that is the Western Cape, its outcomes look mediocre against this pattern? And second, what is it about Kenya that, notwithstanding the fact that it's not a fabulous high-performing bureaucratic machine, its outcomes look pretty good? So I'm going to cut at this from a couple of angles. The first one is I'm going to share with you some very interesting results that we got. This is another chapter in the book. Chapters 8 and chapter 9 in the book are school-level case studies, some in the Western Cape, some in the Eastern Cape. And these school-level case studies, basically they track for, in each province, 4 schools over a 15-year period. They track over the period how performance evolves. And in all of these schools, there's an initial period with one principal, there's a change in principal, and then there's a subsequent period with a second principle. And now, again, I don't have the time to go through all of these results with you, but there's one result in particular that emerges in the Western Cape that I think is hugely worth sharing. Those of you, again, as students of bureaucracy, a book called Street Level Bureaucracy, the problems of managing at the hyper-local level in bureaucracies, a book called Seeing Like a State by James Scott, the challenges of bureaucracies being able to function and, quote, see at the hyper-local level. All of this emerges in a fascinating and powerful way in the school-level case studies. Now, I'm going to give you this example. So what we did in our case studies, these numbers here are the results of standardized tests conducted in the Western Cape by the Western Cape government. What we did is we found the initial intent was it's 4 schools, matched pairs, a high performer and a low performer in each case. Now, here was the really astonishing finding. When we tracked these over time and we tracked the governance patterns, we discovered that both of the schools that were selected in the Western Cape, because they were high performers and they were selected in the early period, by the time you get to the later period, their performance had collapsed. Why? Well, the answer emerges fairly clearly. In that first period, what you had was a school principal who led the school in a determined and demanding way, leveraged the fact that they had a supporting bureaucracy to drive performance, but did this kind of charismatic leadership essentially neglects and undercuts the building of community at the school level, the role and the responsibility of the school governing bodies. So think about what this is. What this is your classic example of top-down hierarchy thinking it is the solution, and participation is noise in the system. What then happened in both schools is when that principal exited, you had chaos. You had, in a sense, stripped away any school-level governance mechanisms, and you had a process of principal selection that turned sour and that produces to the collapse of both of those schools. So one of the ways in which I interpret, and you again have a look at the school-level case studies for this, what we observe in the Western Cape is we observe not just the strengths of what a bureaucracy can do, but we observe the limits of a narrow preoccupation with top-down bureaucratic solutions to solving problems. Let's contrast that with Kenya. So in the course of doing this work and finding these Kenyan results, one of the things that I did was I reached out through Louis Crouch, actually, to another RTI person, fellow who is globally well known in the education space, has been living in Nairobi for a decade, and asked him, why is it, do you think, that the Kenyan schools perform the way they do. And he said, well, you know what's really interesting about Kenyan schools, and this is the quote from him. He said, in a Kenyan school, where we've got the standardized test at the end of 8th grade, in a Kenyan school, if a school does well, then the community gives the principal a parade. If the school does badly, then the community forces the principal out. If we contrast this dimension of the Western Cape with Kenya, in the one case, for reasons I'll come back to in a moment, you have a preoccupation with top-down solutions to the problem. In the other case, you have a culture of participation and expectation in relation to learning outcomes. Where did that come from in Kenya? And here I have some former SCICE students of mine to actually thank for the research that we did on this, because I had a number of SCICE students as part of their term papers. I think one was some were in development strategies, other were in comparative public management, to probe this history in Kenya. It was very fascinating. And it emerges quite powerfully and vividly in the person of Jomo Kenyatta, who was the first president of Kenya. And I learned a lot of interesting things about Jomo Kenyatta's history. I learned that in the 1920s, Jomo Kenyatta was a school teacher. Kenya in the 1920s, early anti-colonial struggle took the form of an indigenous schools movement, as distinct from colonial schools. And Jomo Kenyatta was a leader in that. Jomo Kenyatta goes into exile in Europe from 1930 to 1949. When he comes back in 1949, he interestingly comes back as the principal of the Kenyan African Teachers College, which is the college for teachers run by the indigenous schools movement. When he comes out of his jail, he comes out of jail. When he comes out of jail, he puts front and center in his vision of Kenya, and indeed it's the motto of Kenya, Harambee. Let's pull together, as the vision of how Kenya should work. He puts at center stage one of his first acts as president. He says it is an education system. This is a commission which builds national identity, encourages racial and ethnic intermixing, and supports development. It is through schools that a country and a people define itself as an independent people in a post-colonial world. And indeed, some of the work shows that Harambee becomes a vital aspect of Kenya's school system, not just a political slogan. For education in particular, it was a reality. So we have these sets of narratives, our Western Cape, Eastern Cape, and our Western Cape, Kenya, which lead us to think perhaps in a more complex and nuanced way about the balance between hierarchical and participatory governance as a way forward in addressing education outcomes. And so I want to now take that a little bit further, and I want to take that further at both the micro level and at the systemic level. And I want us to be looking again at this theme. Hierarchical governance, which in this phrase, using a phrase from Lant Pritchett, we call process compliance, to what I will describe, and you will see this play out at micro and broader levels, as the evocation of agency, of a sense of the possibility of affecting change. So let's look first at the micro level. And I'm going to share with you there, briefly, 2 further anecdotes from the school level case studies. Of the 8 schools that we looked at across the 2 provinces, there was only one school, it was an Eastern Cape school, which was able relatively to sustain high performance throughout the entire period. Our Eastern Cape numbers, by the way, there wasn't the same systemic test. So what we had to do for the Eastern Cape was we had data on, because parents could choose where their kids go to school, number of kids over time in the school. This school maintained very high enrollments. It was more than full throughout the entire period. To give you a flavor of how that school functioned, the principal of the school was described for us in an interview of the principal of the school. What would happen when a new teacher was inducted into the school, came into the school? So a staff meeting would be called. The new teacher would be welcomed into the school. And then the principal would say, welcome to the school. The school is a family. This school is a school where we've never had conflict. And if we have any conflict and turbulence in the school going forward, we will know it was you because it's never happened before. It gives you a taste of this participatory culture. The case study describes in great depth how the school is embedded within its broader community. There's another example of the role of participatory governance as a partial offset to the weakness of hierarchy in the Eastern Cape. This is an astonishing story. This is a school which, these data are from 2008. If you went back to that school in about the mid-1990s, it had more than 1,000 kids. It was a reasonably high-performing school. And at that point, the principal of the school bought herself a house on the coast, which was 150 kilometers from the school. Basically stopped coming to school. Stopped coming to school, found one or other source of recourse to not have to show up. This went on for 10 years. After 10 years, the parents revolted, and the parents blockaded this principal from the school. The bureaucracy said, you can't do that. She's our employee. They said, we are doing it. And then, as the case described, you then see a turnaround of the school, the selection with a strong role of the parents of a new school principal, joint effort on the part of the community and the school to turn the school around, and we see the increase over time in the number of parents. So these are just two of the anecdotes, but they give you a flavor of participatory governance. And it leads me, in my micro level set of implications that I draw, it leads me to think about our choices in terms of what is to be done. What are the entry points for change as follows? So let's start here. This is the quality of the bureaucracy. Some contexts think Eastern Cape bureaucracy is weak. Other contexts think the Western Cape is relatively strong. This red line is a reminder to us that when you ask what are the possibilities for change, the possibility is likely not there, barring far-reaching political change of turning a weak bureaucracy into a strong bureaucracy. That's not an option that's available. So what are the choices that are available? We'll flag 3 for you. First, here, if you're in a setting where your bureaucracy is strong and your horizontal governance is relatively weak, there are options, they are explored in the book, to incrementally improve the way that the bureaucracy functions to get better results. There are a variety of things you can do. Principal selection, more creative ways of teacher training. There are things that can be done. There are also, in that environment, the possibility of complementing that, and it emerges in the case studies, with an effort to strengthen the participatory governance dimension of what happens in schools. It turns out that in the Western Cape about a decade ago, when the new government came to power and it was determined to fix the bureaucracy, one of the first things it did was it shut down NGO access to schools. It said, if we want to fix schools, we're going to do it through the bureaucracy. It completely neglected this dimension. And our case studies show us the cost of that neglect. Our case studies also show us that in those contexts where the bureaucracy is weak, it raises a question as to, can you achieve gains by investing to strengthen participatory governance? Now, this is a long and complex question, and it's one in which there's much debate, and there's one in which you can't get a full answer from the kind of case studies that we did. But I couldn't resist including the following graph in this presentation, and I would like any of you later, not now, to tell me if you think I should drop it next time, because it's the first time I've tried this. This is how I think of this question of, can proactive efforts to improve participatory governance make a difference? Some people argue that they can't make a difference because actually at this local level, power relations are locked in and they're captured. The argument that is being made there is that if you think about this as the point, as a switching point between our more developmental actors or more predatory actors dominant within the school, the negative argument says, well, the world looks like this. Most schools are overwhelmingly captured. If, on the other hand, the data were to show that actually there's a pretty even spread between developmental and predatory actors, and this example is just a normal distribution. If it looks like this, then a proactive effort to improve the quality of participation, shifting that distribution to the right, wouldn't change it everywhere, but it would change it in a high enough fraction of schools that it's really an entry point worth pursuing. And what I take from our case studies, and obviously contexts matter a lot here, but what I take from our case studies in both the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape is that the quality of participatory governance is not foreordained by local power relations at the community level, but at least in these contexts, it's contingent and cumulative. We see good outcomes where some of the early actions were supportive, and we see bad outcomes where they weren't. So I think that I'm encouraged that the distribution looks like this rather than this, and thus the potential for gains is substantial rather than non-existent. But that's an hypothesis. It's an hypothesis which the kind of methods that we used for this research don't allow us to address. And now this will bring me to my final theme of the talk. So what I've done so far is I've asked this question, what is to be done, by focusing on the micro level and looking at a series of relative micro level entry points. But you know, this crisis is sufficiently central that maybe working incrementally and cumulatively is slower than there is time for. And the question is, can one do more? Is there a way of engaging that can produce more systemic change more rapidly? And again, in this, I find the framework of the 2018 World Development Report really intriguing. So just to remind you, I shared this with you earlier. Now that same picture also appears at another place in the World Development Report that looks like this. It's essentially the same picture, but the difference is that what's going on here is it is underscoring how an education system and how it functions is the resultant of an incredibly large number of complex interactions amongst a large number of stakeholders. And what you get out of that, they argue, looks like this. They suggest that when the world looks like this, and everybody in a sense, an equilibrium is where people have aligned their behavior to the behaviors of others, and if you change your behavior, others don't change their behaviors, then it's going to have very little effect. They argue that a consequence is that a system can be stuck in low-level learning traps in which each acts in ways which maintain the status quo, even if many, including the stakeholders themselves, will be better off with a shift to a high-quality equilibrium. And they distinguish there, they ask, is the system coherent or is it fragmented? Is it aligned to learning or is it aligned to something else? The example of the Eastern Cape is a system which was fragmented, not coherent, and was not aligned to learning. The example of the Western Cape that I shared with you was a system that was coherent, but was aligned disproportionately towards process compliance. Other systems can be coherent and aligned towards patronage. And so the question is, how do you lock in and how might you change it? And as I've, 6 years into this research on education, and let's see, maybe I'll begin at the age of 10. 54 years into trying to understand the strangeness of South Africa. And if you ask the question, what is it that has locked the South African system into a low-level learning trap? I would argue, more than anything else, it is a deeply, deeply rooted preoccupation with hierarchical solutions as the way to solve problems. Exclusively, if you've got a problem, you solve it hierarchically. Where does that come from? It's deep, deep historical roots. Take Cape Town, where I grew up. Cape Town was 160 years of a slave society. That's from the 1660s, 1670s to the 1830s. Slavery is abolished, and then it's another 150 years of an apartheid society. Most of that for the first 250 years under colonial rule. Both deeply, deeply hierarchical. The traditional society in Southern Africa was deeply patriarchal and hierarchical. And I'll say more about this in a second. The African National Congress, especially in its exile manifestation, was deeply hierarchical, with in particular a commitment to what one might call democratic centralism as the logic of how power was governed. These fed their way in to what happened at the transition to democracy. The transition to democracy was driven in significant part by a mass civil society uprising, but that turned out to be unexpectedly brittle. Very quickly after democracy had come, that civil society demobilized. Meanwhile, and there's a quite comprehensive discussion of these themes in chapter 10 of the book, meanwhile, the ANC, in its mode of governing, turned to what it knew best, which was hierarchical modes of decision-making. And when you listen to the policy discourse in South Africa, it's a policy discourse in which the term that is overwhelmingly used is delivery. Government delivers. Voice and participation are perceived as hindrances to getting on with business and to delivery. And if we think about that, if we think of this preoccupation not just with hierarchy, but also in this vision of hierarchy, with process compliance as the way in which hierarchy functions, that's what we see in what I've described for you. We see an endless preoccupation with writing plans and with coordination in this environment, with new public management as the way to fix hierarchies, but isomorphic mimicry. We see at the provincial level a preoccupation that the necessary and sufficient condition for achieving gains is fix the bureaucracy, with all the limits that we've had. And at the school level, for reasons we can explore in discussion, we see essentially an abandonment of what was built into the institutional arrangements at the outset, namely participatory governance at the school level. And we contrast that with Kenya. We contrast that with a setting where, notwithstanding bureaucratic weaknesses, the idea of all for education emerges as a powerful countervailing force which, for half a century, trumped I guess I'll use that verb, which for half a century trumped the otherwise weaknesses of the bureaucracy and produced surprisingly strong learning outcomes, which brings me to my final slide, my conclusion, which is for all of us working in these spaces, even as our own skills lead us to want to think about systems, training, processes, and incentives, we want to be thinking also about the role, the transformative power of ideas. If you want to change that equilibrium that is locked in with all of those messy interactions, what will change that equilibrium is a transformative idea. I can share with, I can suggest mechanisms for going in at the school level or for going in wholesale at school levels. But if a society embraces a transformative idea, and in this case the idea would be not education for all. Education for all is the kind of transformative idea that top-down bureaucracies can deliver. But seeing a learning crisis and a quality crisis, all for education, that change is not just what can happen at the school level. Parents, communities, teachers, principals can change actions at the organizational level. Bureaucracies begin to function differently. Unions could function differently. Non-governmental organizations could move from a preoccupation with the latest infrastructural disaster to a focus on what might it take to bring quality. And indeed, it turns out that within a week of his becoming the president of South Africa, in a State of the Nation address in February of 2018, Cyril Ramaphosa embraced Hugh Masekela, and one of the great songs from the great South African jazz trumpeter and musician Hugh Masekela, a song called Tuma Mina, which means send me. And so my hope is that as South Africa moves into a political transition again, that there can also be, having learned the limits of hierarchy, there can also be an embrace of an all of the above way of addressing the learning crisis. And that's what I had to say. Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes, and any questions anyone might have, please, feel free. Please.
Yeah,
could I ask who you are?
Jerry Mendez, I'm an independent consultant and advocate in inclusive development, by which I talk about disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
There's the book and its challenges discuss disabilities. If so, what did you find out? If not, respectfully, why?
Okay, well, the short answer is it doesn't. And I guess I would begin by asking you a question. If 80% of sixth graders cannot read, is children with a disability all kids, or is it of those 80% the subset? I mean, I pose it as a rhetorical question, but that's the reality of the learning crisis across the developing world.
You've got kids in the classroom who struggle with learning, often with undiagnosed problems. Many who are stunted, have stunted.
No, I know, but
Then you've got a significant number of out-of-school children who have disabilities.
I know, but I'm not going to stay with this, but let's stay with that core number. 80% of the children in the classroom spend 6 years in the classroom and aren't able to read at the end. How do we deal with that fact? I mean, sorry? First, yeah. I would agree. I would agree with that, and I would agree with that. But those are the dilemmas. Please, some more. Tanvi.
Thank you, Brian. Just a really quick question, which maybe goes to your issue of sort of agency and people coming up with their own solutions. The outcomes in India are always terrible on any given large social service delivery. And it's not surprising that they are terrible here as well. But in India, the option has been that there's a huge number of alternative schools that have come up at the community level. And this is also the case in Kenya, actually. So did you take that? I mean, how does that compare with what has happened in South Africa?
So that's a great question. And when I teach this material at SAIS, I spend quite a lot of time on the experience of the charter school movement in the United States, because I think it's a very interesting and it's a very interestingly mixed experience about the circumstances under which it works well and the circumstances under which it works badly. In this research project, we made a strategic decision to stay completely away from that topic. And we did that for two reasons. One is 90% plus of the kids are in public schools. The second one is that the discourse around whatever charter schools get called in that environment is rapidly ideological and toxic. And because it's so ideological and so toxic, and because as I read that institutional environment, the potential for low-hanging fruit is to implement what is already institutionally in place, namely the prospects for participatory governance, it seemed wise not to walk into what would have actually shut down any discourse around these results.
I understand. I'm just asking a fact.
No, but
Is it different in South Africa? Not that many options.
no, there are not that many options. Yeah, the fact is that there are not many options. But there could be. We could have taken on this research. You could draw from this research. Why don't you just have a more pluralistic system? We chose not to go down that path. Let me take a student, and then I'll turn to Judy, and then over there. Please. You're not a student, but where's a student? There's a student. Oh, you're a student. Okay, you are a student. You looked at me like, yeah, okay.
It'd be cool if I wasn't, but I am.
Okay, you are, okay.
Thanks a lot. So I guess I agree with this idea that we all should have more individual agency, and maybe that is really a core problem with the South African education system. But looking at my own experiences, and I'm trying to visualize how do we build individual level agency or even community agency. And if you have some concrete ideas, I'd love to hear that.
Excellent. So the huge advantage of the South African setting relative to many others is that the legislative framework for schools basically gives substantial authority to school governing bodies in which parents are a majority. And so then the question that arises is, how is that used insofar as it isn't being used well? How could it be used better? There's a backstory on the distinction between these kind of school governing bodies and their role in elite schools versus their role in schools in poor communities. And I won't go into the details of that backstory now. Both seemed to matter in the beginning, but as this process unfolded over 2 decades, only the first got attention. As part of It's not exactly research, because you're not asking a research question, but you're asking a, well, what could work question. As part of this, I worked with an NGO that had been working in low-income schools on trying to strengthen participatory governance at the school level. And in a very, very small sample, their evidence seemed rather strong that you can make a difference relatively quickly. The challenge is, can you make a difference at significant scale? And where that led us to was trying to think about a mechanism in which you could build networks and clusters of schools with facilitating agents who could support the parents in relation to each. If you read the school-level case studies, as I mentioned in the talk, the evidence is fairly clear that it's almost an accident as to whether the path which unfolded was a pathway of relatively effective participatory governance or was a pathway of capture. So the hypothesis is that working through network of schools and facilitators who work across those networks, you could make a difference at scale. Do we know? I don't know. What I do have in the book is I have a set of about 10 countries that went down that kind of path and seem to have had significant gains. But that is indeed a critical frontier question. Judy?
Yeah, Judith Edstrom, former World Bank and RTI. I lived in Kenya as well as South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, Judy and I, we worked together.
We worked together right after the Democratic.
Weren't you also an education specialist?
I was an education
there
specialist in all over Africa. My kids were born in Kenya, and I was with the bank in South Africa at the Democratic change and worked with Brian. So this is so exciting, I can't believe it. 2 points, though, or questions. You mentioned, and it's really interesting, I didn't know about Jomo Kenyatta in terms of indigenous education. One would, I think, though, the British at least fostered the colonial rule of Anglophone countries, did foster self-rule much more than, say, the Francophone. So that may have also helped in Kenya, while racialist approaches in South Africa negated that, perhaps, even in the Cape where they were strong. But the problem that remains, because I work in citizen engagement now, you know, is the elite capture, both in health and education, where the more educated parents, you know, make sure that their kids get it, get the health, get the education. Did you, and that still exists in Kenya as well as many developing countries, did you find that as a stumbling block in terms of getting more participatory approaches? Or how do you overcome that?
So this book really works at the case study level. In my earlier book, which I have refrained from even mentioning to this moment, Working with the Grain, in the earlier book, I discussed this dilemma of a lead capture. And you know, I spoke about it here with that graph that I showed you with those two distributions in terms of what is plausible and what's not. When one reads the literature around a lead capture, the literature often has a disturbing aspect to it, which doesn't mean that a lead capture is absent, but the literature basically goes like this. It says, our goal in these participatory initiatives is to target only poor people and to have mechanisms through which the governance is anchored in poor people. What we observe is that actually within a community, there's also participation on the part of some of the more powerful actors in the village, and some of the benefits also go to these more powerful actors. But now, here's the dilemma. That is going to happen inevitably, and indeed, if what we're looking at is a dynamic of power, you need developmental allies who have some power. So the question is, when does some elite participation and some skewing of benefits translate into capture? And when is it just part of the fact that the world isn't only either perfect or disastrous, but there's a messy middle in between? And you know Kenya better than I do, but as I read the Kenyan narrative, and this is at least through to 2007, there was enough going on that was broadly participatory. And by the way, when we look at that graph that I showed on Kenya versus the other SACMEC countries, Kenya is an outlier even though all of those countries were British colonial. There's enough operating that it leads me to say that in Kenya, and I'm anchoring this up to 2007, and it's tied to school fees, it's tied to many things, the glass was probably a little bit more than half full. And frankly, a little bit more than half full isn't full, but it's much better than empty. So that's how I think about that issue.
More of a middle class, in other words, even though generally poor, at least less skewed inequality.
No, even if it's unequal. Elites who actually act, at least in part, on behalf of the village as a whole, not just only on behalf of their own kids. Because that's part of what's going to happen. And that's, I think, what we see. There was another question. I think it was one. Was there one there too? So let me go 1, 2.
Hi, my name is Chris, and I'm a first-year administrator. I'm wondering, in the case of Kenya, what extent was their mother tongue instruction? What role did that play? I ask because I know that's something that sometimes happens in Kenya in early education. And my experience teaching in West Africa, I taught 5th grade in French, and most kids, French was their second language. They barely knew French, so obviously that made instruction challenging.
So I can only say you've gone beyond my space of expertise. One of the things that is true about this research is I'm a trespasser. I'm not an education specialist over the course of my life. What I am is a person who works on the governance and politics of service provision. And have tried to do in this research program over the last 6 years is to ask, what do we learn from that perspective? And I note the issue of mother tongue, but I don't have anything to add on that. So thanks for pointing it out. Please.
As well as sometime adjunct here. Excellent presentation. Thank you very much. It reminded me a lot of Montgomery County, Maryland, in some of the non-transparency and the desire to avoid participation. So even in a high-resource zone, I'm seeing some interesting, perhaps imagined analogies. My question is, it seems like a hellish problem set for donors or donor representatives to try to influence the improvement of educational outcomes through bureaucracies. Yet the World Bank and bilateral donors seem to try to do that. It just seems it's so nuanced that it would be very hard for an outside agency to fix in any
Yeah. So it's easier for me. It's true that I've spent the large majority of my career working in an international agency and broadly. I have the luxury in the context of this work in working in a particular country where, as a dual national, I happen also to be a citizen. So in that context, I think I know what the large message is that I hope to communicate with this work, which is this move from a preoccupation with hierarchy and delivery to a version. The interesting thing about schools, there's some work that's been done in the South Africa context that talks about the school governing bodies as the 4th tier of democracy, because it's a hyper-local level of participatory governance. And so in that context, in a time where inequality, the populism that follows from inequality, the anger that follows from all of that risks becoming hugely corrosive. My hope is that this is one example, and there are others, of ways forward that are inclusive, invite agency, and bring hope. And now whether this, if we listen to the discourse on education globally right now, is I mentioned the strange dialogue of the deaf between the education technocrats and the people that are trying to take this broader systemic view. And I think the place where those connect is learning systems and ideas around change, which is a different way of thinking. And I can't resist it. If you heard Montgomery County in the background, my wife worked for 15 years as a counselor in the Montgomery County public school system. And yeah, so I learned a lot from her. Please. Yeah. So there are a lot of programs around the world and studies of those programs around the world on the potential benefits of engaging parents, and they're significant. So that is a plausible entry point. A necessary condition for that entry point to gain traction is to shift from a sense that learning and schooling is the responsibility of the teacher and the school and the bureaucracy to learning and schooling is a responsibility of all of us. And it seems that in this particular setting, where that version of delivery and expectation is so deeply rooted, in order for what you're describing to take root, one also wants to shift the idea of what does it take for learning to happen. Learning is everybody's responsibility. And that's sort of, in a sense, what I think of as ultimately the larger punchline from this. But as an entry point, yes. Let me take one final question, and then I have a 2 o'clock class. Please, let's do a few of you with me.
My name is Rachel. I'm a last commentator for general interest in international education, and I come from New Orleans, which is arguably the charter school in the United States. And looking at charter schools and basic education, what role do you think the community versus outside actors have, especially in developing communities or in vulnerable communities, and the long-term goals of education as it relates to the development of the community as a whole, and especially like in terms of the idea of how innovation and new models have to be brought into it?
Yeah, so that's a much bigger question than I can take on. The only thing that I do want to note, because it's what I take as the message from the research on charter schools in the US, if the governing framework within which those charter schools are operating is robust and is able to sort learning from opportunism, then you can get quite substantial gains. And you can also do this, as Massachusetts has done, in a way that doesn't necessarily destroy public school systems. New Orleans, of course, has a particular history because Katrina wiped out so much, including the public school system. But I think we know that if the governing framework for charter schools is weak, then what you can end up with is all kinds of opportunism and capture. But as an instinct, you can't go wrong if you also engage participation in the community as part of that. But that's, I think, the biggest. So let me thank you all for coming. It's the first launch of the book, and I really appreciate Stephanie and the Development Roundtable for making it possible.
So yes, thank you so much for coming and for that great presentation. I also want to give a few shout outs and a few thank you. You guys are getting ready to leave. First, thank you so much to the Bologna cohort for joining us from abroad and also just making sure to be in tune for what is going on here. I also want to thank you all for coming to this event. Please feel free to grab more food as you head out. And then I also want to make sure that you guys are all invited to our next roundtable event, which will be on October 18th with Andrea Simone, who is the president and founder of Finca. So if you would like to know more about that and you're not in the IDEV program, please talk to me and I can add you to our mailing list. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you, Stephanie.